I'm Camille Labchuk. I'm a lawyer and the Executive Director of Animal Justice. We're a national animal law advocacy organization focused on working to improve animal protection laws as well as their enforcement. Unfortunately, Canada, including Ontario, have some of the worst animal protection laws in the Western world, including when it comes to protecting dogs from puppy mills and backyard breeders. We commend the government for recognizing that this is a significant problem and the need to tackle dog breeding. But I have significant concerns about this bill, and in my view as a lawyer, the PUPS Act won't do much, if anything, to crack down on puppy mills or backyard breeders, and it is mostly unenforceable. So today I'll touch on the problems with dog breeding run amok in Ontario, why the bill as drafted doesn't go far enough, and what meaningful action actually would look like. I will elaborate on these points in Animal Justice's written submissions given the time constraints. So to set the scene, bad breeding, I think we all agree, is a huge problem. These can be massive six-figure cash-based operations that don't pay taxes, or they can be small, quote-unquote, mom-and-pop operations in someone's backyard with poor conditions. But the fact is that Ontario is the Wild West for dog breeding right now because anyone can breed dogs for profit with absolutely zero oversight from the province. And if this bill passes unamended, that won't change. Early in the pandemic, we all understand now that demand for puppies skyrocketed, and a lot of people made some very easy cash by breeding dogs and selling them online to unsuspecting members of the public, often via platforms like Kijiji, where oversight is non-existent and there's no screening for the right home. This unregulated breeding leads to two problems. The first we're talking about today, that's terrible conditions in breeding facilities. And the second is it leads to more dogs than people actually need and the so-called market can support. I think we've all read the news stories about dog abandonment in Rouge Park the winter before last, and breeders are dumping dogs as well when they no longer need them. CTV Kitchener reported last December that Hillside Kennels Animal Control was full after 2 adult males and 10 Shepherd Cross puppies were dumped by a puppy mill or backyard breeder in their catchment area, putting the shelter in a position where it was forced to make tough decisions about euthanization. Rescues, humane societies, and shelters are the ones who pay the price, while breeders are the ones who are raking in massive profits. So we believe it's time to get this unregulated breeding problem under control. But as drafted, the PUPS Act doesn't address this issue. So I'm going to just talk about what the PUPS Act actually does do, and I'm going to cover 3 issues. The first is the insufficient definition of a puppy mill. The second is the need for standards of care for dogs used by breeders. And the third is the inability to enforce laws against breeders due to the current lack of licensing. So the PUPS Act definition of a puppy mill is quite sparse and it leaves out a lot. It restricts the frequency of breeding female dogs, which is good, to 3 times in 2 years. Could go farther, but that's a good start. It bans breeding female dogs under 1 year and bans inbreeding and requires quarantining sick dogs and keeping dogs in sanitary conditions. These are all generally positive, but this really just scratches the surface of the poor conditions that dogs in puppy mills endure. Notably, the definition doesn't include any restrictions on the size of an operation, which is a major factor impacting dogs and their well-being. It doesn't require veterinary care, vaccinations, socialization, exercise, or set clear standards for housing. So this means that a person could still warehouse 100 breeding dogs plus their puppies in a windowless factory dog farm, keep them in tiny wire cages 24/7, fail to give them meaningful exercise, allow their fur to become matted, sell the puppies without vaccinations, and this operation would still not be a puppy mill in the eyes of the bill. So I appreciate that the bill does allow government regulations to come in the future, but there's no clear rationale, in my view, for including some restrictions under the Act while waiting for others to come via regulation. This allows for uncertainty. I note that we're still awaiting quite a few promised animal welfare regulations under the PUPS Act that have yet to materialize. So I urge the government to start consulting very quickly on regulations if that is in the cards. But the biggest structural problem is that the few protections the PUPS Act does allow for, and including any future standards of care that might come by regulation, are not enforceable. The province and Animal Welfare Services, the enforcement agency, just currently don't have any information about who it is that's breeding dogs and where those facilities are operating. They must rely on tips from the public to find puppy mills. And those tips are very uncommon because puppy mills tend to operate inside barns or people's basements or outbuildings. They're not in places that the public can see and report on. So that's why they're so difficult to detect, and that's why only a licensing regime can solve this problem with enforcement. By requiring that breeders be licensed, animal welfare services would be aware of where they're located and could carry out proactive inspections to determine compliance with any regulations. I can't build a patio in my backyard without a permit. You need a license to be a hairstylist in this province, and you should need a license to breed dogs as well. The licensing regime would also give authorities a quick way to shut down a problematic breeder rather than laying charges, going through the court process, getting a conviction, and hoping the judge is going to impose a prohibition order on future ownership. Moreover, the government should require that any person who sells a dog must display their license at the physical location or in an online ad. And we don't have time to get into online ads today, unfortunately, but that's a huge area that needs addressing as well. The costs of overseeing a licensing regime, of course, should be borne by fees from breeders and not by the public purse. And I should note on enforcement that enforcement by animal welfare services is currently problematic and quite non-transparent. The agency doesn't have a website, it doesn't release news releases about its enforcement activities, and it's not actually known, at least I don't know, if it's ever busted a single puppy mill. The service has 4 times the budget of the former OSPCA, yet it has issued only a third of the remedial orders and charges that the OSPCA did. So we potentially have an underactive enforcement agency, and the ministry should conduct a full audit to determine the extent of this problem, and I think that's a really critical part of any legislative or enforcement effort to tackle puppy mills. So to wrap up, I want to thank the government for its interest in protecting dogs. It's a big step, but we urge you to strengthen the PUPS Act to ensure it's actually meaningful and not just window dressing. The recommendations that we submit are to amend this bill to require licensing for commercial dog breeding with appropriate fees and conditions, an inspection before a license can actually issue, and a license number to be posted and shared during any sales transactions.